Every biological superweapon used in ancient warfare? Explained. All right, let's go. Number 10. The bee-bombs of Hatra, the only ancient siege in the historical record where the defending force repelled a Roman army using ceramic grenades packed with live insects, and the archaeological evidence for it sat unexamined in a museum basement for decades. In 198 CE, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus conducted a military siege of Hatra, a fortified Parthian city in northern Mesopotamia, located at approximately 35.58 degrees north, 42.72 degrees east in what is present-day Iraq. Hatra's defensive walls reached approximately 10 meters in height and were reinforced by approximately 160 towers. Severus had already attempted one siege of Hatra in 197 CE and abandoned it after 20 days. The second siege extended over a period of approximately 18 to 20 days before Roman forces withdrew, a failure that ancient sources, including Cassius Dio, attributed to an inability to breach the walls and to the defenders' unconventional use of projectiles. The anomaly was the contents of those projectiles. Archaeological excavation of Hatra, conducted by Iraqi teams beginning in 1961 and documented in reports by Fuad Safar of the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities, recovered a substantial number of small ceramic pots from contexts associated with the city's defensive perimeter. These vessels, approximately 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, were sealed with bitumen and contained interior chambers too small for conventional incendiary materials. Subsequent analysis by archaeoentomologist Paul Underwood, reviewed in the context of broader bioweapon history by Adrienne Mayer in her 2009 work Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs, identified the insect remains and chitin fragments recovered from several of these vessels as consistent with social hymenoptera, wasps or hornets of the genus Vespa, most likely Vespa orientalis, the oriental hornet, which is native to the Mesopotamian region and produces colonies of up to 1,000 individuals. The vessels, when shattered against Roman assault teams in confined spaces, such as siege tunnels or at the base of ladders, would have released the colony in a defensive response state, producing approximately 1,000 individual stings per vessel in a confined radius. The bee-bomb account entered Western historiography primarily through Cassius Dio's Roman History, written approximately 30 years after the siege. Dio's account describes the defenders throwing earthen vessels and attributes the Roman withdrawal partly to disease, partly to inadequate provisions, and partly to the missiles thrown from the walls. The specific entomological content of the vessels is not stated in Dio's text. The version of the siege that circulated in subsequent Roman and Byzantine historical literature described the Hatran resistance in general terms as reflecting strong fortifications and defender determination. The ceramic insect weapon interpretation was not proposed in the formal academic literature until Mayer's synthesis in 2009. The insect vessel hypothesis was not formally evaluated by an independent archaeological team at Hatra, as the site became inaccessible to international researchers following regional instability beginning in the 1990s. The site suffered documented destruction in 2015. The Safar excavation records, held partially at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, are the primary physical basis for the hypothesis. No formal publication formally classifying the ceramic vessels as bioweapon delivery systems has been issued by an academic institution. But the identification of Vespa orientalis as a viable weapon species is not dependent on the Hatra vessels alone. The Oriental Hornet's colony defense response, triggered by vessel rupture, vibration, or sudden light exposure, produces an attack pattern with a radius of approximately 10 meters, a duration of 20 to 30 minutes per disturbance event, and individual stings delivering approximately 3 to 4 micrograms of venom per strike. At a sustained rate of deployment, a defending force with access to harvested colonies could have imposed a casualty rate via anaphylaxis and venom toxicity that would have been indistinguishable to a Roman field surgeon to disease or environmental illness. The Oriental Hornet's native range covers approximately 3.2 million square kilometers of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe, every theater in which ancient bioweapon use of hymenoptera has been proposed. Number 9. The Scythian arrow poison. The nomadic steppe warriors who fought Alexander the Great's Macedonian army in 329 BCE used a compound arrowhead poison whose active mechanism was not identified by Western medicine until the late 20th century, and whose synthesis required a level of biochemical knowledge that ancient sources did not credit to its manufacturers. In 329 BCE, Macedonian forces under Alexander the Great crossed the Oxus River and entered Sogdia, the region of present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, at approximately 40 degrees north, 63 degrees east, beginning a campaign against Scythian and allied forces. The campaign accounts, preserved in Arrian's Anabasis Alexandri and Quintus Curtius Rufus's Historiae Alexandri, record that soldiers struck by Scythian arrows experienced wound progressions inconsistent with simple penetrating trauma. The wounds became rapidly necrotic, with extensive tissue death beyond the wound margin, and casualties who survived the initial strike frequently died within 48 to 72 hours from what the sources describe as systemic collapse. Alexander himself was struck by an arrow during the campaign and experienced a wound progression that ancient sources describe with unusual specificity relative to its apparent size. The anomaly was the accelerated necrotic margin. Adrian Mayer of Stanford University, in a 2009 paper in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, and independently toxicologist John Scarborough of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, in earlier work published in Bulletin of the History of Medicine, analyzed the ancient sources' descriptions of Scythian arrow poison against the pharmacological properties of compounds derivable from materials within the Scythian range. The synthesis that most closely matches the described wound progression is a cocktail identified in the ancient sources themselves. Scythian accounts preserved in Greek sources describe a poison derived from decomposed human blood mixed with snake venom, specifically viper hemotoxin, fermented in sealed animal hide containers buried underground for a period of weeks. The active compounds produced by this process include clostridial bacteria producing histotoxic proteins combined with phospholipase A2 from viper venom, which potentiates tissue destruction. The combined mechanism produces a wound that exceeds the penetrating injury's radius through enzymatic tissue digestion, the exact progression described in the Macedonian campaign sources.
Greek accounts of Scythian arrow poisons circulated widely in ancient medical literature, appearing in the Hippocratic corpus and in Theophrastus's botanical writings. The version of the poison that entered Greek medical tradition described it primarily as a plant-derived preparation, specifically from the root of a plant Theophrastus calls Scythicon, tentatively identified by modern botanists as Veratrum album or a related species. The microbial fermentation component, described explicitly in Scythian accounts as transmitted through Greek intermediaries, was either not transmitted to Greek medical authors or was omitted as implausible. The abridged plant-based version is what appears in subsequent classical and medieval toxicological literature. The full pharmacological mechanism was reconstructed in modern terms in Scarborough's analysis, which was published in 1977 and revised in subsequent decades. The reconstruction received limited uptake in mainstream ancient history scholarship. The poison was not formally classified as an early example of combined biological toxicological weaponry in any military history survey published before Mayer's 2009 synthesis. And yet the specific combination of clostridial infection and hemotoxic venom potentiation that Scarborough and Mayer's analyses identify is not an accidental preparation. The burial fermentation process, the selection of pit viper species rather than neurotoxic cobras, and the use of human blood rather than animal blood as a bacterial substrate each represent technical decisions that optimize the wound progression mechanism. Whether these decisions were arrived at empirically over generations of weapons development or represent a discrete moment of systematic development cannot be established. The Scythian steppe range across which this compound was documented military use spans approximately 7 million square kilometers from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Number 8. The Mongol siege of Kafa. The 1346 CE catapult deployment of plague-infected corpses over the walls of a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea coast is the most consequential act of biological warfare in documented human history by any reasonable measure of downstream mortality. In the autumn of 1346 CE, Mongol forces of the Golden Horde under the command of Johnny Beg besieged the Genoese fortified trading post of Caffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula at approximately 45.0 degrees north, 35.4 degrees east, present-day Feodasia, Ukraine. The siege had been ongoing in intermittent form since 1343. By 1346, the besieging Mongol army was experiencing significant attrition from an outbreak of plague that was simultaneously advancing across Central Asia. The primary contemporary account is provided by the Genoese notary Gabriele de Musis in his Historia de Morbo, written no later than 1348, which states that Johnny Beg's commanders, observing their own casualties from disease, ordered the corpses of plague victims placed into catapults and launched over the walls of Kafa. The anomaly is the epidemiological continuity between the siege and the subsequent European mortality event. Mark Wheelis of the Department of Microbiology at the University of California, Davis, published a formal analysis of the Kafa event in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases in 2002, examining the biological plausibility of corpse catapulting as an effective disease transmission mechanism. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, is transmitted primarily through the bite of infected fleas rather than through direct contact with corpse tissue. Wheelis concluded that the catapulted corpses were unlikely to have been the primary transmission vector. The flea population associated with the corpses would have dispersed from the cooling bodies and sought new hosts, including the Genoese defenders, with greater efficiency than any direct tissue contact. The siege thus constituted effective biological weapons deployment regardless of whether the intent was specifically flea dispersal or simple psychological warfare through corpse contamination. The detail that resists the conventional framing is the intentionality. The commanding officer's decision to use diseased corpses rather than disposing of them to contain their own outbreak represents a deliberate choice to weaponize an ongoing epidemic. De Musis's account circulated in Italian manuscript form and was known to several 14th century chroniclers. The version of the Caffa siege that entered mainstream European historical consciousness attributed the introduction of plague to Europe primarily to Genoese sailors who fled Caffa following the siege, carrying the disease to Messina, Sicily in October 1347. This is accurate as a transmission pathway, but the framing displaced the Caffa siege itself from the causal chain in most popular historical accounts. The deliberate corpse deployment aspect was treated in mainstream medieval historiography as incidental or as atrocity narrative rather than as a documented weapon strategy. Wheelis's 2002 analysis was the first peer-reviewed publication to formally examine the Caffa event within a bioweapons framework rather than a purely historical epidemiological one. The event was subsequently included in the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's historical background documentation on biological warfare. No international legal body has formally classified the Caffa event under contemporary frameworks for biological weapons use, as such frameworks postdate the event by 6 centuries. But the downstream mortality attributable to the 1346 to 1353 Black Death pandemic, of which the Caffa siege is documented as a proximate origin point for the European wave, is estimated at 30 to 60% of the European population, representing 25 to 50 million deaths on that continent alone, with additional mortality across Central Asia and the Middle East. The total pandemic death toll is estimated at 75 to 200 million individuals across Eurasia and North Africa. Whether the European pandemic would have arrived by an alternative maritime route in the absence of the Caffa siege is not calculable. What is calculable is that the lag between the Caffa siege in autumn 1346 and the arrival of plague in Messina in October 1347 is 12 months, consistent with the documented travel time of Genoese merchant vessels from the Black Sea to Sicily on established trade routes. Number 7. The poisoned wells of the Assyrians. Cuneiform records from the 8th and 7th century BCE document a deliberate waterborne biological warfare program employed by the Assyrian army that represents the earliest written evidence of organized waterborne biological warfare in the archaeological record. Between approximately 710 and 650 BCE, the Assyrian Empire under successive kings including Sargon I and Ashurbanipal conducted military campaigns across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau. Assyrian military records preserved on clay tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh and held in the British Museum under catalogue designations in the Q-Ninjit collection include logistical and tactical accounts of siege and field operations. Among these records are references to the contamination of enemy water sources using botanical agents. The relevant passages describe placing specific plant materials identified in the cuneiform text using Akkadian terms that correspond to hellebore in subsequent pharmacological literature into wells, cisterns, and aqueducts serving besieged populations. The anomaly is the specificity of the plant selection.
Hellebore, most likely Veratrum album or Helleborus orientalis in the species available to Mesopotamian foragers, contains steroidal alkaloids including Veratrum alkaloids, gervine, cyclopamine, and veratramine that produce at oral doses of approximately 1 gram of dried root material per kilogram of body weight a clinical syndrome including profound hypotension, bradycardia, emesis, and neuromuscular paralysis. Jelle Bruin-Slot of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Amsterdam, in an analysis published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2017, reconstructed the dose-effect relationship for hellebore alkaloids in drinking water contamination scenarios. At a concentration achievable by placing approximately 500 grams of dried hellebore root in a 500-liter cistern, a quantity readily transportable by a single soldier, the resulting water produces clinical hellebore toxicity in an adult male consuming a normal daily water intake of 2 to 3 liters within approximately 4 to 6 hours of consumption. The concentration is not detectable by odor or color change at this level. The single detail that challenges a non-deliberate interpretation is the exclusivity of hellebore selection. The Assyrian texts do not describe adding organic matter generally, but name a specific botanical agent with properties precisely suited to waterborne delivery. The British Museum tablets containing these references were translated and catalogued by Robert Francis Harper of the University of Chicago in his Assyrian and Babylonian Literature 1901, and by subsequent Assyriologists including Archibald Sayce. The passages describing botanical well contamination were published in technical transliteration and translation, but did not receive analysis as bioweapons documentation in either the original publications or in standard Assyrian military history treatments through the 20th century. The standard historiographic framing of Assyrian military innovation emphasized iron weapons technology, siege engineering, and cavalry tactics. The pharmacological tactics appeared in academic literature on Assyrian plant knowledge rather than in military history literature. The well contamination passages were first formally analyzed within a bioweapons historical framework by Adrian Mayer in Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs 2009. No subsequent dedicated pharmacological archaeological study of the Assyrian well contamination program has been published in a peer-reviewed venue. But the operational logic of the Assyrian program represents a systems-level weapons deployment rather than an opportunistic tactic. Hellebore harvesting, drying, and transport as a dedicated military supply requirement implies institutional knowledge of the compound's properties, a supply chain for its preparation, and tactical doctrine for its deployment, none of which are consistent with improvised poisoning. The Assyrian Empire's military reach at its maximum extent covered approximately 1.4 million square kilometers of the Near East. Within that operational theater, the number of wells, cisterns, and water collection systems that were military targets during the approximately 60-year period of documented Assyrian expansion is not enumerable from surviving records, but the hydraulic infrastructure of the region, documented in contemporary archaeological surveys, numbers in the thousands of discrete installations. Number 6. The Roman toxic smoke at Dura Europos. Beneath the collapsed siege tunnel in a Roman-era city on the Euphrates, archaeologists in the 1930s found the remains of 19 Roman soldiers in a configuration that took until 2009 to interpret correctly, and the interpretation required a classicist to read a chemistry paper. Dura Europos was a fortified Roman garrison city located on the west bank of the Euphrates River at approximately 34.75 degrees north, 40.72 degrees east in present-day Syria. Between approximately 256 and 257 CE, Sassanid Persian forces besieged the city and conducted an extensive program of countermining, tunneling beneath the Roman defensive walls to collapse them. Roman defenders responded by countermining, and the resulting tunnel system beneath the city's western wall has been the subject of excavation since the 1920s, initially by Franz Kuhmann and subsequently by a Yale University French Academy expedition beginning in 1928. In one of the tunnels, excavators found the remains of 19 Roman soldiers, collapsed in a configuration suggesting sudden incapacitation in a confined space, along with the remnants of a Sassanid-side tunnel entry point and deposits of an unusual sulfur and bitumen ash material. The initial interpretation attributed the deaths to tunnel collapse. The anomaly was the soldiers' positions. Simon James of the Department of Archaeology at the University of Leicester published a formal reanalysis of the Tower 19 tunnel evidence in 2009 in the American Journal of Archaeology. James's analysis addressed the spatial distribution of the 19 Roman bodies, stacked in a heap at the tunnel entry point, in postures inconsistent with collapse from falling debris, but consistent with rapid incapacitation in a standing or crouching position, along with the chemical residues recovered from the tunnel floor. The residues, analyzed by a materials conservator at the Yale Peabody Museum, were identified as consistent with the combustion products of a mixture of sulfur crystals and bitumen, both of which occur naturally in the Euphrates Valley, and both of which are documented in ancient technical literature as components of incendiary and toxic smoke preparations. Combustion of this mixture in an enclosed tunnel produces sulfur dioxide at concentrations exceeding 500 parts per million, the threshold for immediate incapacitation in an unprotected human subject, within approximately 30 seconds of sustained burning in a space of less than 10 cubic meters. The single detail that James's analysis identified as underweighted in the tunnel collapse interpretation was the presence of a Sassanid soldier's remains at the ignition point, in a posture consistent with having operated bellows or a draft enhancement device from the Persian side of the tunnel junction. The 1930s excavation report, published by the Yale French Academy team, described the Roman soldiers' remains as a mass burial and attributed them to combat in the tunnel or to collapse. The sulfur bitumen residue was catalogued as a construction or fire damage deposit. The spatial analysis that James later used to distinguish between these interpretations was not performed at the time of excavation. The 1930s report circulated in classical archaeology literature as a standard account of Roman-Persian mine warfare. James's 2009 reanalysis received coverage in archaeological press releases and was reported in several science journalism outlets. It was not incorporated into standard Roman military history textbooks or survey works on ancient warfare by the time of its publication. The formal classification of the Dura-Europos tunnel event as an instance of chemical or biological weapons deployment, specifically toxic gas production, was not taken up by any official military history body.
And yet the operational implications of James's reconstruction are significant. The Sassanid use of sulfur dioxide in a mine tunnel required at minimum knowledge that the compound produced rapid incapacitation, access to sulfur and bitumen in military supply quantities, and the tactical decision to introduce it into a tunnel where enemy soldiers were known to be present rather than to simply collapse the tunnel. Each of these conditions implies a pre-existing tactical doctrine for chemical tunnel warfare. The Euphrates Valley natural sulfur deposits that would have supplied this operation extend across a band approximately 800 kilometers in length through present-day Syria and Iraq. Number 5. The Spartan sulfur fire at Plataea. The oldest documented use of chemical biological smoke as a deliberate tactical weapon in European warfare was recorded by Thucydides in 429 BCE and has appeared in military history accounts ever since, stripped of the specific mechanism that makes it a weapon system rather than a fire. In the summer of 429 BCE, during the third year of the Peloponnesian War, Spartan and Boeotian forces besieged the city of Plataea, located in Boeotia at approximately 38.2 degrees north, 23.3 degrees east. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 2, chapters 75 through 78, provides the primary account of the siege. The Spartan forces, having failed to breach Plataea's walls by conventional escalade, and after constructing an earthwork ramp that the Plataeans raised their walls to counteract, attempted to burn the city using a combination of wood, brush, and a mixture that Thucydides describes as theon, sulfur, and pisa, pitch. The Spartan forces introduced this mixture into the brush pile at the base of the walls and ignited it, producing what Thucydides says was the largest fire produced by human means up to that point in his experience. The anomaly is what Thucydides notes about the wind. Thucydides records that the fire failed to
And yet the operational implications of James's reconstruction are significant. The Sassanid use of sulfur dioxide in a mine tunnel required, at minimum, knowledge that the compound produced rapid incapacitation, access to sulfur and bitumen in military supply quantities, and the tactical decision to introduce it into a tunnel where enemy soldiers were known to be present rather than to simply collapse the tunnel. Each of these conditions implies a pre-existing tactical doctrine for chemical tunnel warfare. The Euphrates Valley natural sulfur deposits that would have supplied this operation extend across a band approximately 800 kilometers in length through present-day Syria and Iraq. Number 5. The Spartan sulfur fire at Plataea.
The oldest documented use of chemical biological smoke as a deliberate tactical weapon in European warfare was recorded by Thucydides in 429 BCE and has appeared in military history accounts ever since, stripped of the specific mechanism that makes it a weapon system rather than a fire. In the summer of 429 BCE, during the third year of the Peloponnesian War, Spartan and Boeotian forces besieged the city of Plataea, located in Boeotia at approximately 38.2 degrees north, 23.3 degrees east. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 2, chapters 75 through 78, provides the primary account of the siege. The Spartan forces, having failed to breach Plataea's walls by conventional escalade, and after constructing an earthwork ramp that the Plataeans raised their walls to counteract, attempted to burn the city using a combination of wood, brush, and a mixture that Thucydides describes as thion, sulfur, and pisa, pitch. The Spartan forces introduced this mixture at the base of the walls and ignited it, producing what Thucydides says was the largest fire produced by human means up to that point in his experience. The anomaly is what Thucydides notes about the wind. Thucydides records that the fire failed to destroy Plataea because a rainstorm extinguished it, but he also notes that if the wind had been favorable, the city would have fallen. John Lenz of Drew University, in an analysis published in the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine Studies Journal in 2005, examining ancient Greek fire weapons, and separately, military historian Alfred Bradford in With Arrow, Sword, and Spear, A History of Warfare in the Ancient World, 2001, both address the specific chemical properties of the sulfur-pitch mixture. Combustion of sulfur in combination with pitch produces sulfur dioxide as the primary toxic byproduct in concentrations that, at wind-driven dispersion into a confined urban space, would reach incapacitating concentrations of 100 to 500 parts per million across an area dependent on wind speed and urban canyon geometry. Thucydides' reference to wind as the variable determining the fire's effectiveness is not merely a note about combustion spread, it is a note about directed toxic gas delivery into the city's interior. The detail that the conventional siege fire framing leaves unaddressed is why sulfur was added at all. Sulfur alone is a more efficient incendiary, and sulfur reduces rather than increases the caloric output of the mixture while adding the gaseous toxic component. Thucydides' account of Plataea circulated through the entire subsequent Greek and Roman military literature and was treated as the foundational account of Greek siege warfare. The sulfur element was consistently translated and discussed in terms of fire intensification. The toxic gas interpretation, which requires no additional information beyond Thucydides' own text read against basic combustion chemistry, does not appear in classical scholarship before the late 20th century. Standard translations of the relevant passage through the 20th century rendered thion as brimstone and contextualized it as a fire enhancement agent. The sulfur as toxic smoke interpretation was not formally presented in peer-reviewed classical scholarship as of Mayer's 2009 synthesis, which noted the gap between the chemical reality of sulfur combustion and its treatment in the ancient warfare literature. No formal reclassification of the Plataea event as a chemical weapons incident has been issued by any academic or military body. But the Spartan tactical decision to add sulfur to a combustible mixture at the base of a city wall is not explicable by fire intensification logic alone, since sulfur is less efficient fuel than pitch. The decision is explicable by toxic smoke logic, which requires prior empirical knowledge of the compound's biological effect on enclosed human populations. That knowledge, represented as a deliberate tactical choice in 429 BCE, predates the next formally documented instance of deliberate military toxic smoke deployment, the Dura Europus Tunnel, 685 years later, by a duration sufficient for the underlying knowledge to have been transmitted, developed, and institutionalized across the entirety of the classical Greek and Hellenistic military tradition. Number 4. The poisoned honey of Pompey's army. In 65 BCE, a retreating force in the Black Sea region left honeycombs along a Roman army's line of march in quantities and locations that can only be described as deliberate, and 1,000 Roman soldiers became combat ineffective within hours of consuming them. In 65 BCE, the Roman general Pompey the Great was conducting a campaign in the Pontus region along the eastern Black Sea coast in present-day northeastern Turkey at approximately 41 degrees north, 37 degrees east, following his defeat of Mithridates VI of Pontus. During the advance through the Colchian highlands, Pompey's troops encountered honeycombs left along the roadside. The primary ancient source is Strabo's Geographa, Book 12, Chapter 3, written in approximately 20 BCE, which records that the soldiers consumed the honey and subsequently became incapacitated. A later account by Pliny the Elder in Naturalis Historia, Book 21, corroborates Strabo's account with additional detail about the honey's origin. The number of affected soldiers given in ancient sources ranges from a few hundred to 1,000. The anomaly is the honey's pharmacological properties. The region around Trabzon and the eastern Pontic highlands is the primary habitat of Rhododendron ponticum and related species including Rhododendron luteum, both of which produce nectar containing granotoxins, polyhydroxylated diterpenes that bind to voltage-gated sodium channels and produce a clinical syndrome in humans including hypotension, bradycardia, loss of coordination, and altered consciousness at oral doses achievable by consuming 25 to 30 grams of the resulting honey. Lionel Stopforth of the Toxicology Unit at Guy's Hospital in London published a clinical review of granotoxin poisoning in Clinical Toxicology in 2005, documenting that mad honey intoxication, still occurring in the Pontic region among local consumers and tourists, produces a consistent clinical picture lasting 6 to 24 hours, from which recovery is complete in the absence of complications. The dose achievable from a single honeycomb is sufficient to incapacitate a soldier for the majority of a day. The detail that renders a non-deliberate interpretation insufficient is the distribution of the honeycombs. Strabo specifies they were found along the road, in positions accessible to the marching column, in a region where Mithridatic forces were in active retreat and had motive to impede pursuit.
Strabo's account was known throughout antiquity and appeared in subsequent Greek geographical and natural history literature. Pliny's corroborating account in Naturalis Historia described the toxic honey in the context of unusual natural phenomena rather than military tactics. The military application, deliberate deployment of toxic bait along an enemy's line of march, is noted in both Strabo and Pliny, but was not analyzed as a tactical weapon system in subsequent classical military literature. The event appears in modern ancient history accounts primarily as a curiosity of natural pharmacology. The event was first formally analyzed as an instance of deliberate biological or toxicological warfare in Mayer's 2009 work. The granotoxin mechanism was confirmed in modern clinical terms by Stopforth's analysis. No classical archaeology publication has formally addressed the strategic logic of the honeycomb placement as evidence of deliberate deployment rather than coincidental availability. And yet Rhododendron ponticum does not produce honey with uniform granotoxin content across all seasons and harvest conditions. The toxic alkaloid concentration is highest in spring nectar and varies with altitude and microclimate. A population familiar with the plant's properties, which the Pontic highland communities, including Mithridatic military planners drawing on local knowledge, demonstrably were, given Strabo's account of the local population's awareness of the honey's effects, would have had to have harvested honey specifically in the conditions that maximize toxicity and deploy it within a time frame before potency degraded. The Pontic highlands, where Rhododendron ponticum achieves maximum alkaloid-producing density, cover an altitudinal band approximately 400 kilometers in length along the eastern Black Sea coast. Number 3. The burning ships of Hannibal at Eurymedon. In 190 BCE, Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, commanding a naval force for the Bithynian king Prusias, defeated the fleet of Eumenes II of Pergamon by catapulting ceramic pots of live venomous snakes onto the enemy's rowing decks, and the tactic worked.
In approximately 190 BCE, Hannibal Barca, then in exile from Carthage and serving as a military advisor to Prusius I of Bithynia on the southern shore of the Black Sea, commanded a Bithynian fleet in a naval engagement against the fleet of Eumenes II of Pergamon, Rome's ally, at a location near the mouth of the Eurymedon River on the southern coast of present-day Turkey at approximately 36.8 degrees north, 31.1 degrees east. The primary ancient source is Cornelius Nepos' Lives of Eminent Commanders, specifically the chapter on Hannibal, written in approximately 35 BCE. Nepos' account states that Hannibal, observing the Pergamene fleet's numerical superiority, ordered his sailors to collect the largest venomous snakes obtainable in the preceding days, and to seal them in earthenware pots. During the engagement, these pots were directed primarily at Eumenes' flagship by catapult. The Pergamene crew, confronted with the pot's contents on their rowing deck, broke formation. The Bithynian fleet carried the engagement. The anomaly is the targeting logic. Justin's epitome of the Philippic history of Pompeius Trogus, a later source corroborating Nepos' account, specifies that Hannibal directed the snake pots primarily at Eumenes' flagship rather than distributing them across the engagement. This targeting decision is consistent with a decapitation strategy, disrupting the command vessel, rather than an attempt to use the snakes as a general-purpose area weapon across a fleet engagement. The species of snake most plausibly available for bulk collection on the southern Turkish coast in the 2nd century BCE includes Macrovipera lebetina, Levantine viper, and Vipera ammodites, nose-horned viper, both of which are ambush predators that can be collected in quantity by experienced handlers and which produce hemotoxic venom with medically significant lethality in untreated bite cases. John Scarborough, in his analysis of ancient toxicological weapons, published in Pharmacy and History, 1977, estimated that the psychological disruption of a confined deck space filled with actively defensive vipers would have been sufficient to prevent coordinated oar management, regardless of actual bite casualties. Rowing a trireme requires synchronized movement by 170 oarsmen and is instantly disrupted by any stimulus that breaks the stroke cadence. Nepos' account circulated in Roman biographical literature and was known throughout the classical period. The snake vessel tactic appeared in subsequent natural history and military anecdote literature, including in Aliens on Animals and in Polyaenus' Stratagems of War. The version of the story that circulated in Renaissance and early modern military history treated it primarily as an example of Hannibal's individual resourcefulness rather than as a documented weapon system with operational parameters. It does not appear in standard treatments of ancient naval warfare as a tactical category. The event has not been the subject of a dedicated military historical or archaeotoxicological analysis in a peer-reviewed venue. Mayer's 2009 synthesis provides the most systematic treatment. No formal archaeological work has been conducted at the Eurymedon engagement site, which is located in shallow coastal water near the present-day city of Mangavat, Turkey. And yet, Cornelius Nepos' account is specific about the preparatory timeline. The snakes were collected in the days before the engagement, implying advance intelligence of the forthcoming battle and deliberate procurement, and about the catapult as the delivery mechanism, implying that the vessel catapulting technique was within the standard operational capability of the Bithynian fleet. The tactic required no specialized equipment beyond the fleet's existing artillery, and the biological component required only collection effort and appropriate containers. The engagement at the Eurymedon was one of at least 3 ancient naval encounters for which ancient sources describe non-conventional biological or incendiary projectiles, suggesting that snake bomb and bee bomb tactics were sufficiently well established by the 2nd century BCE to constitute a recognized tactical option across the eastern Mediterranean, a body of water covering approximately 970,000 square kilometers. Number 2. The Plague Arrow of the Hittites. A cuneiform document from approximately 1320 BCE records the oldest known written accusation of deliberate biological warfare in history, and the accused party appears to have infected its enemy's livestock, army, and civilian population with a disease that killed the Hittite king. In approximately 1320 BCE, the Hittite Empire under Shubbaluliuma I, the Great King ruling from Hattusa at approximately 40.0 degrees north, 34.6 degrees east in present-day Turkey, was at war with the Arswana states and conducting campaigns into Egypt's northern territories. The Hittites captured Egyptian prisoners of war during operations in the Levant and brought them back into Hittite territory. Within a period of months, a plague of significant lethality spread through the Hittite army and then into the general population, killing not only soldiers but members of the royal court and ultimately Shubbaluliuma I himself, who died in approximately 1322 to 1320 BCE. The sequence of events is documented in a series of cuneiform tablets known collectively as the Plague Prayers of Mursili II, Shubbaluliuma's son, held in the Hittite collections of the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, Turkey, and the Berlin Vorderasiatic Museum. The plague prayers include an accusation. The anomaly is the specificity of the accusation's mechanism.
Mursili II's Plague Prayers, translated and analyzed by Albrecht Getze of Yale University in the Journal of the American Oriental Society 1950, and subsequently by Hans Gustav Güterbach of the Oriental Institute University of Chicago, contain a passage in which Mursili II identifies a specific act as the origin of the epidemic. The Egyptians, he states, drove livestock that had been afflicted with a plague into Hittite-controlled territory as part of a diplomatic or prisoner exchange. The Hittite acceptance of these animals, which the text implies were presented as tribute or trade goods, is identified as the point of entry of the disease. Trevor Bryce of the University of Queensland in The Kingdom of the Hittites, 1998, analyzed this passage and noted that it constitutes the oldest written description of deliberate biological transmission via contaminated biological vectors in the historical record. The single detail that resists the interpretation of accident is that the animals are described as already visibly afflicted at the time of transfer. The plague prayers circulated as cuneiform administrative and religious documents within the Hittite archive system and were recovered in the initial excavations at Hattusa beginning in 1906. The tablets were translated and published in technical Hittite scholarship through the first half of the 20th century. The biological warfare interpretation of the livestock transfer passage was noted by Bryce in his 1998 synthesis, but did not appear in general ancient history or military history literature as a classified instance of early bioweapons deployment. The passage was formally analyzed as a bioweapons document in Mayer's 2009 synthesis and in a standalone analysis by Robert Arnott of the University of Birmingham's Institute of Archaeology and Antiquity, who in a 2006 paper in Anatolian Studies reviewed the epidemiological sequence and proposed that the disease involved was most likely a hemorrhagic fever of the type endemic to the Levantine region, possibly transmitted via the livestock vector. No definitive pathogen identification has been made, but the downstream consequences of the biological event described in Mursili II's plague prayers are not limited to Shubbaluliuma I's death. Mursili's own prayer texts describe a plague lasting 20 years and depopulating significant portions of the Hittite heartland. Egyptian records from the reign of Horemheb, approximately 1319 to 1292 BCE, reference a plague affecting Canaanite and northern populations during this period that Egyptologists, including John Wilson of the Oriental Institute, have correlated with the Hittite account. If the livestock transmission event was deliberate, it constitutes the earliest documented instance of biological weapon producing strategic-level consequences, the destabilization of a major state, the death of a ruling monarch, and a demographic event affecting a population distributed across approximately 500,000 square kilometers of Anatolia and the Levant. Number 1. The Athenian water supply contamination at Kirrha. The oldest confirmed instance of deliberate biological warfare in Western history occurred in approximately 590 BCE, was carried out by a coalition of Greek city-states including Athens, was formally proposed and planned by a named individual, and has been documented in ancient sources for 2,600 years without the majority of ancient history scholarship classifying it as what it was.
In approximately 590 BCE, a coalition of Greek states, including Athens, Thessaly, and Sicyon, acting under the authority of the Amphictyonic League, besieged the city of Kirrha, also recorded as Crissa, located in Phocis at the head of the Gulf of Corinth at approximately 38.4 degrees north, 22.4 degrees east, near present-day Achaea, Greece. The war, known as the First Sacred War, was fought over Kirrha's interference with pilgrim access to the oracle at Delphi. The siege lasted an extended period during which the coalition was unable to reduce the city by conventional means. According to the primary ancient source, Frontinius's Stratagemata, approximately 84 CE, a physician named Nebros, or in some manuscript traditions, Solon's associate Cleisthenes of Sicyon, proposed a solution. The solution involved the city's water supply. The anomaly is what was added to it. Frontinius's account, Book 3, Chapter 7, states that the besieging forces diverted Kirrha's water supply and then reintroduced it downstream after adding hellebore, Helleborus species, in quantities sufficient to affect the city's population. The Kirrhan defenders, having been without water during the diversion period, consumed the contaminated supply upon its return. The resulting mass incapacitation of the defenders allowed the coalition forces to breach the city. Mayer's 2009 analysis and independently a review by Scarborough and Pharmacy and History, 1977, both addressed the pharmacological mechanism. Helleborus orientalis, distributed across the Greek highlands, contains cyclopeptide alkaloids and protoanominin with emetic and cardiovascular depressant properties at doses achievable from water supply at concentrations describable from Frontinius's account. Scarborough's estimate of a meaningful reduction in defensive capability, sufficient to allow a breach, is pharmacologically consistent with the event as described, at concentrations achievable from bulk root material deposited in an aqueduct-scale water channel. The detail that resists coincidental interpretation is the physician's role. Nebros's professional identity is not incidental in Frontinius's telling. The plan required pharmacological knowledge to select the correct agent, determine effective concentration, and predict the onset time of mass incapacitation. The First Sacred War and the Siege of Kirrha appear in Greek historical sources, including Aeschines, Pausanias, and Strabo, and the event was referenced in Athenian legal oratory for centuries as a precedent for Amphictyonic authority. The water contamination tactic appears in all primary accounts, but is rendered in translations and commentaries through the modern period as a note on siege ingenuity or as a footnote to the political history of the Amphictyonic League. The pharmacological specificity of the hellebore selection, as opposed to the simple fouling of water with organic material, is not addressed in standard translations of Frontinius available in university curricula. Scarborough's 1977 analysis was the first peer-reviewed pharmacological examination of the Kirrha event. Mayer's 2009 synthesis contextualized it as the oldest confirmed instance of deliberate biological chemical warfare in Western history. No formal reclassification of the event within the framework of international conventions on biological or chemical weapons has been proposed, as all such frameworks contain explicit provisions limiting their scope to the modern state system. What every entry in this list shares is not tactical sophistication or institutional scale, it is the prior knowledge of a biological mechanism specific enough to be weaponized deliberately, documented at a moment in history that precedes the formal scientific characterization of that mechanism by centuries or millennia. The people who contaminated the wells at Kirrha in 590 BCE, who sealed hornets into pots at Hatra in 198 CE, and who drove plague-infected livestock into Hittite territory in 1320 BCE were not improvising. They were applying, in operational conditions, a body of empirical biological knowledge that their descendants would not formally articulate until the development of germ theory, toxicology, and entomology as distinct scientific disciplines. The gap between knowing how to do something and knowing why it works is, in the history of biological warfare, a gap measured not in decades but in thousands of years. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.